dar as boas-vindas para a professora Louise Burke. Como eu falei inicialmente, a professora Louise Burke é uma autoridade mundial na área de nutrição esportiva. Todos nós, né, que de alguma forma estudamos fisiologia do exercício, nutrição esportiva, nós lemos, né, os artigos e os livros da professora Louise Burke. Ela teve uma influência muito grande nas nossas formações, por se tratar de uma referência na área de nutrição esportiva. Então, para nós foi uma alegria muito grande, professora, a senhora ter aceito o nosso convite aqui do GSSI Brasil para estar conosco. A gente sabe que tem uma diferença de fuso horário grande aí, é cedo da manhã na Austrália, e a gente está extremamente honrado em recebê-la. E eu poderia ficar agradecendo aqui a noite inteira, porque realmente é um momento marcante para nós ter a oportunidade de escutá-la, mas eu vou passar a palavra para a senhora aqui e novamente, sinta-se muito à vontade e sinta-se em casa no GSSI Brasil Virtual. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the lovely introduction and the opportunity to be almost in Brazil. So I've been given the task of trying in 20 minutes to give you an overview of different dietary assessment methods for working with athletes. And it's going to be a whirlwind presentation because of the need to put so much into 20 minutes. I'm trying to move my slides forward, but they're not moving. Can you see me now? Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
All right, so this is what we're going to try and cover in the next 20 minutes. An overview of why do I do dietary assessment in athletes and what are the particular characteristics that I'm looking for so that I can choose the best method. We'll then look at some of the traditional methods, the ones that look at retrospective food intake in the past, the ones that look at new intake in the future, and then we'll have a look at new technologies and how to make a good decision. So there's plenty of times in an athlete's life when you'd like to know what they eat. And one of the challenges of being a sports dietitian is that it's almost impossible, whether it's with athletes or sedentary community people, to get a really true and valid picture of what people are eating. But there's some different characteristics of why you might want to find out this information that might make you choose a particular sort of method. So let's think about some of the situations in which you'll try and assess what an athlete's food or dietary intake is. The first one is if you're doing research and you're wanting to look at a group of athletes and what they're eating and whether there's any influence on health or performance. And this is really a research tool. There are other times when you might want to find out of the group of athletes what they're eating, just as a descriptive measure, you're not trying to relate it to anything other than just describe what you see. And you might be doing that for a research practice, thinking about just describing whether athletes follow the guidelines that we've established, or you might be doing it in your own practice where you're trying to work out where are the areas of nutrition need. What are athletes currently doing and what do I need to try and help them to improve their practices? You might also be trying to look at whether changing dietary intake makes a difference to some aspect of health or performance, and so you're looking to measure changes in dietary intakes after an intervention. Or you might be doing research where you want the athletes to consume a standardised diet the days before the performance measurement so that you can try and control the reliability of performance, and then you want to know whether the athletes actually followed the dietary standardisation techniques that you gave them. And then lastly, when you're working in practice with an individual, you might like to measure what they're doing to assess their nutritional status, but also to measure the changes following your intervention. And sometimes you want athletes to assess what they're eating, not so that you can measure that for yourself, but rather you're using the tracking process as a way of consolidating changes because you're making the athlete more aware of what they're doing and how well they're being able to make the changes you've suggested. So they're all different scenarios in which an athlete's assessment of intake might be wanted. And now we've got to think about what are the characteristics that you're wanting in that process, because no one single process will meet all these different characteristics, and not every characteristic is important on every occasion. So here are some of the things that you might be wanting to build into your assessment task. First, the validity. Can you measure exactly what the athlete ate? And can you be sure that what they ate and recorded represents the period that you're interested in, whether it's a particular period like carbohydrate loading before a marathon, or whether it's their typical training diet. You want to make sure that what they gave you as their intake really represents what they normally do. Sometimes you're interested not so much in getting the absolute truth, but being able to be reliable so that if you do it on a number of occasions, you can measure a real change rather than just the errors in your technique. What kind of information is coming for your assessment can differ. Sometimes you're wanting to quantify energy intake or nutrient intake. Sometimes you're happy just to have a qualitative intake change. Did you measure an increase or a decrease in someone's intake without needing to get it to quantitative levels? Sometimes you don't want to really just worry about the energy and nutrients, but you're interested in specific foods or food groups, or maybe you're interested in people's behaviour. Why do they eat what they eat? What leads them to do it? What sort of behaviours are explaining their food intake? And then lastly, sometimes you're looking not just at average intake, but looking at the change in intake from day to day, the way athletes may change their intake because their training changes, or sometimes you're interested in looking within the day, not just the average intake, but how is it spread over the day? How is it spread around different training sessions that were undertaken? So these are all different kinds of aspects of the assessment, and depending on what you're interested in, you need to choose a tool that will help you to elucidate this information. So let's look at some of the traditional ways in which dietitians measure intake of food. And the first types of intake assessment tools are what we call retrospective, or looking at things that happened in the past, asking an athlete about what they ate yesterday, as in a dietary recall, or using a dietary history to ask an athlete what do they normally eat in the past over their typical intake or a specific period of time. Now, the pros of, or the benefits of using these kinds of retrospective methods is that you're not altering the athlete's intake. It's already happened, and what you're doing is getting them to describe it. And if you've got someone who's trained in this process and they're following a structured format, and they've got tools such as photos or models of food that help people to identify what they eat and the quantities that they're eating it in, you can come up with a reasonably accurate lot of information. The good thing for the athlete is that most of the work is being done by the interviewer, so it takes some of the pressure from the athlete, and it gives you an opportunity to look at why people are doing things if you're asking the right questions. But the disadvantages of the retrospective methods is that you're relying on the athlete's memory and their honesty and their food knowledge. And if athletes don't know a lot about food, they're not able to explain it to somebody very well. Of course, it takes a skilled interviewer, and depending on how long you're asking the athlete to recall their food intake for, it mightn't be able to look at their typical intake if you're just asking people what they ate yesterday. But they're all methods which can contribute to an assessment of an athlete's dietary patterns. One of the other retrospective methods that can be used is the food frequency questionnaire. And you can see on this side of the slide, I've given you some examples. And the questionnaire consists of a number of questions that ask an athlete to pick the type of foods that they might eat, and then how often and what size serves might they have. These kinds of retrospective methods are good because they can be undertaken by the investigator without too much interaction with the athlete, so that it saves time. They can be automated to be able to be quickly processed, and you can use them as a cross-check for other different kinds of methods. The problem is that most of these methods overestimate intake because people see the food and they think, oh yes, I eat that, and they tend to overestimate the number of times or the number of serves that they had. Now, many of these questionnaires are good for being able to isolate certain nutrients. If you're interested, for example, in dairy intake or caffeine intake, they're very good at being able to specify specific nutrients. But they also need to be validated with the particular population you're interested in, and very few of these have been validated with athletes. So while they're useful, they may not be enough on their own to give you a very accurate assessment. Let's now move to what we call the prospective methods of food intake. This is where you're asking an athlete to record in the future their food intake. And the traditional method is with the paper and pencil. And we can do it in a number of different ways, but we generally try and divide it into those which ask the athlete to weigh everything that they eat and drink over a period of time and note it on their record, or those which ask athletes just to estimate their food intake. And they're often given things like cups and spoons and different kinds of dimension guides so they can describe their food intake in terms of household measures. So the benefits of using a dietary record to assess intake is that it allows the athlete to do a lot of the work and to get some insight into what they're eating, to be able to describe it to you. There's good reasons to use the weighed food diary because it gives you very accurate information of the food quantities, although it's often burdensome to the athlete. The disadvantage of having to weigh everything is that the athlete often doesn't have the opportunity to take it into all their food environments, and it takes a lot of time. But the major disadvantage of both these methods of food records is that you're relying on the participants' honesty, but you're also relying on them not to change what they normally do. And we all know that when athletes are being watched, they put on their best behaviour rather than their usual behaviour, or even just the activity of writing down everything and measuring everything or quantifying everything makes the athlete change what they normally eat to make it easier to achieve the task. The problem with the estimated food diary without weighing things is that athletes are often very unaware of food, and their poor food knowledge or their poor nutrition knowledge means that they estimate things very badly. So there's some advantages in using these kinds of techniques, but there are some disadvantages. Some of the issues that you might need to think about when you're using a food record is how long do you get the athlete to do it for? And it depends whether you're interested in just measuring a period of their time, for example, what they eat the day before a race or what they have in the period between the weigh-in and the competition in a weight division sport. But if you're interested in measuring an athlete's usual intake, then we have to record for long enough so that the food that they can describe really does represent their typical intake. Generally, we tend to use 3 to 7 days of food recording to try and measure usual intake, and that's okay for some nutrients, but for many nutrients which are very variable in food, 3 to 7 days isn't enough to get an athlete's usual intake. Even though sedentary people might have more of a usual pattern of eating where they eat the same from day to day, we now promote to athletes that they should periodise their nutrition, that they should change the way they eat from day to day according to the training that they're doing. And so one of the disadvantages of doing 3 to 7 days of a food record is that you may not have captured all the different ways in which the athlete changes their food patterns according to their training needs. Generally, we have a trade-off between the compliance to food records and how well they represent usual intake, in that the longer that you can get an athlete to keep their food record, the more likely it is to represent their typical intake, but also the longer that people record, the less compliant they are, the more they start to cut corners or become inaccurate because the burden of keeping the record becomes too great. And so when you're working with a group of athletes and trying to decide how long they will record for, you need to take into account, is it likely that they're changing a lot from day to day? And how likely are they to want to keep recording in terms of compliance? and there's usually a trade-off. One of the ways that you can try and get around this as a compromise is to get the athlete to keep a number of different food records over a period of time. So they might do 2 days and then 3 days and then 2 days. And so over a period of time, they capture a lot of information without having the burden being continuous. But with these records, we said there's all different sources of error. And if we try and think about where these errors come from, because we want to try and reduce them, the first source of error comes with the athlete, where they're writing down food information that they may misrepresent. They don't know enough about the nutrition or food to be able to correctly identify the food or describe it well. And particularly, they provide incorrect information about the quantity that they consumed. They may also change their intake because of the burden of doing the record. The next level of error comes with the dietitian who's reading the food record and then trying to interpret the information. They may misunderstand the food entry. They may not be able to understand the athlete's writing or their description. They may then miscode that information when they're putting it through the dietary analysis program, and they can do that either because they're just making typographical errors or because they're mismatching the foods. And then the third level of error is with the nutrient composition package that you're using, that some of these packages don't contain all the foods that athletes eat, and so there's inability to be able to assess some of the foods that might be most important to athletes because they're specialised for their sport, or some of the nutrient databases also are incorrect. So even though you're taking a lot of time and effort to collect this information, these errors can make problems with the interpretation. And as we've said before, there's a big problem with the misreporting or the misrecording of true intake. And this can happen for 2 different reasons. The athlete is asked to do a food record over the time period that's not usual in terms of their lifestyle, and so what they're writing down for you might be accurate for what they did over that period, but it's not representing usual. But sometimes the athlete will change their food intake just because they're recording. They often want to appear to be eating better because they want you to be pleased with them, and so they'll record better food intake than normal, or they'll actually lie about what they consume. But sometimes they'll also change what they're doing because it's just a nuisance to have to take so much time to represent or to describe a very complicated meal, and so they'll just choose something simple to make it easier to keep the record. Most of the time, and we'll see in a minute, the errors in keeping the food records tend to under-reporting, that the athlete either eats less food over the period of recording than they normally would, or the athlete eats food but then doesn't write it down on their food record. And there's different ways in which you can try and control for that, or at least assess for that when you're looking at a food record. If an athlete is not eating as much as they normally do during that period of time, you'd expect to see a change in their body weight or their body composition. And if you can measure that, that gives you some insight into how well they've kept the record, or how well that record is representing what they normally eat. But sometimes we can use biomarkers. You can measure something about the food intake or some aspect of a nutrient or energy distribution. And if you then match that with what the athletes recorded on their food intake and you find a discrepancy, then you know that they've actually eaten the food but haven't recorded it on the record. So how often do these errors occur with the athlete assessments, and what do they mean in terms of the results that we get? This is a nice paper that has been done by some colleagues of mine in Australia, where they've done a systematic review of dietary assessment of athletes, and one part of their meta-analysis looked at comparing studies in which athletes were asked to record their food intake from a period of up to 10 days, between 4 and 10 days, a mean of about a week. They measured their body mass and the stability of their body composition over this period of time. And then they also used energy expenditure measurements through doubly labelled water to try and validate whether the energy intake that was reported and the energy expenditure that was measured through another technique were in balance. And when the 11 studies that fitted this criteria were assessed, they found that on average, the athletes were underreporting their energy intake by about 19%. So about a fifth of their true intake was underreported. And although you could say, well, why don't we just then correct everybody's food record and add an extra 20% to the top to bring it back to what might be more truthful, the problem is that there's differences across the studies, in between the studies, within athletes within the different studies. That means that there's no single correction factor that's applicable. In these studies, on average, some athletes underreported by 40%, but some up to nearly 40%. And that's equivalent to around about 660 calories per day on average, but it could be up to 1,000 calories a day difference between what was truly reported and normal intake. And this systematic review found that the bigger eaters, the larger athletes, or the athletes that train the hardest and have the highest energy requirements are more likely to underreport. So it means that we need to be very careful when we assess the interpretation of these assessments. So let's now just move on to the end towards the new techniques that are coming out. And technology provides us with lots of new opportunities to collect information about intake. And so the first ones to comment on are all these new dietary assessment apps that come with smartphones and iPads and different tablets. And what these particular ones I'm showing you here now are targeting our consumers. These apps are all made for consumers to be able to track their own intake. And sometimes this is used by a practitioner who has the athlete do it and then come in and share the results in a consultation. The benefits of using these kinds of apps are that they're very easy to use, they have very large databases, they often have different kinds of facilities where they can allow the athlete to scan a food or scan a label or use well-known information from restaurants. And all that information is contained in the database. So it's certainly much easier for the athlete than writing down everything. But the disadvantage of some of these tools, and you might recognise some of these different apps, we've got MyFitnessPal, Meal Tracker, MyPlate, all just different examples of this, is that they're very much focused on energy and macronutrients, and they're not very suitable for giving you good information about many of the micronutrients. Many of their databases are missing information, and sometimes the databases have been put forward by crowdsourcing. They allow people who are using the apps to add their own information, and so you can get a lot of error being involved. I think these tools are really useful, but they're better for use as a self-tracker and for counselling than research because of those errors. But there are some other apps or other different programs that you can get, computerised analysis programs, which are more geared to a practitioner and suitable for research. These also have the benefit of being easy to use compared to paper and pencil, have all these added features that make it easy to scan or to add food in. They certainly reduce the dietitian burden compared to doing a normal paper and pencil food record, because all the information is already added into the assessment without the dietitian having to do the entry. And many of these programs have two forms. They have an easy-facing app that the athlete can use to collect the information, and that then transmits the information to the research level platform that the dietitian can use, and they can do the assessment with more rigor and better information than some of the consumer apps. So while these are certainly beneficial compared with some of the manual food paper and pencil records, they still have the same problems as those records, in that they're relying on the athlete to be motivated to do them well and also to be honest. And one of the best ways that you need to check whether this honesty and ability to not change their food intake during the period of recording occurred was to use some biomarkers or to cross-check with some other assessment tools. We'll just finish off now by looking at some of these really new tools and techniques that are involving the use of images or photos to measure food intake. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of techniques and I can't go into them all, but we can divide them into different sorts on a couple of different characteristics. Some are used as an assistance to another method, so they're just image assisting, giving more information to a food record that the athlete's already keeping. So adding photos to a food record can be helpful in adding extra information for the athlete to discuss with the dietitian, or for the dietitian to understand what the athlete's doing. But some of these new techniques are becoming image-based on their own. They're just requiring the athlete to take a photo rather than to provide any other material. How they take that photo can vary. Some of them are active, that they require the athlete to have the camera or a smart device and take the photos themselves. But then there's some new techniques being developed where the athlete is a passive capturer of these photos, where they're wearing a camera on them and the camera just automatically turns on when the athlete eats. It picks it up. There's some clever ones that when the athlete's jaw moves to simulate chewing, the camera just turns on and makes a record of what the athlete's eating. And this is good because it means that the athlete is more truthful because they're not involved in making a decision whether you're recording what they're eating. How that information is then processed can vary according to the technique. In some cases, the photos are sent back to the dietitian, who has to interpret them and then add them to the database. But now we're moving to artificial intelligence, where a machine can make decisions about what an athlete ate based on that photo. And I'll show you an example here. This is a very, very new space age kind of technique. This particular technique is called the toda, which is the technology-assisted dietary assessment app. And what it has is an interface where the athlete takes a photo of the food. That food photo is sent to a server. The server has artificial intelligence, which can recognise what the food looks like and then makes a decision about whether they understand it or needs more information. The information goes back to the athlete to clarify, yes, this is what you got this right. No, I can provide you with more information if you didn't understand it. It then goes back to the server. The server has artificial intelligence that allows the quantity of the food to be assessed, which is pretty remarkable, and then is added to the food database to do the assessment. And so this is a very sophisticated technique which tries to take a lot of the individual or personal errors out of things. There's still errors going to be involved. Obviously, the athlete has to take the photo in a very standardised manner. And if they don't do that, there's often lots of problems. Whether the information is sophisticated enough to pick up very complex food, where food is in very complex meals all added together, is going to be a source of error. One of the interesting things to think about is whether this technique changes the way that athletes eat, because it's not always possible to be able to take photographs of food, and sometimes athletes are uncomfortable about doing that in public. There may be environments in where you're not allowed to have smartphones, like at school. And it also has to think about the Privacy Act. If you've got cameras that are automatically switching on when an athlete's eating, there may be some privacy issues in that environment that need to be controlled. And also, it doesn't account for the food that doesn't get eaten. If the athlete takes a photo of their plate before they started, it may not take into account the fact that they didn't eat at all. So let's leave you with a summary of, if you're trying to do dietary assessment, what you need to consider. And because I can't go through all this information with enough detail to give you a really good summary, I've pointed you to the direction of a Gatorade Sports Science Institute article that I've written. You can see the information for where you can get this article on dietary assessment methods. What I've tried to do is look at the pros and cons of these different methods in this article. And what I point out is that you need to think about what's important for you to assess, and then think about the dietary assessment method that best suits your purposes, and also the resources that you've got. You've got to think not just what's being collected, but how much time and burden it's going to be on the subject to do the assessment and you to then do the calculations and the interpretation. And so you look through the different assessment tools to see what suits your purpose. Once you've chosen your tool, then you need to use strategies to optimise the method. You need to be able to engage the subject to think that there's a value in doing the exercise, so they do it as well as possible. And you can often train them to know where errors occur so that you can help them to reduce the errors or bias in their part of the assessment. You need to be skilled as a professional in being able to take the data and interpret it and handle it, particularly if you're wanting to quantify things from photos or from household measure descriptions. That's a specialised technique that you need to train yourself in. And then you need to look at the assessment outputs and interpret that information, knowing the errors that were involved. I'm just giving you a little example here of what we often see in the literature, where people write down what they collected from an assessment without really understanding the interpretation. And as a dietitian, when I see an article like this, I get really frustrated, because I can look at that and say there's no way that this is a good assessment. It's not realistic, and the level of precision that people are trying to claim with decimal points is not valid. So I'm hoping that better understanding will get rid of these kinds of articles. And then the last thing is that let's be excited by this new technology. It can make our lives very much easier as practitioners, and it can also make the opportunity to do dietary assessments less painful for the athlete. But we need to understand that there's likely to be new errors in the way that the data is captured and interpreted, and it also may change subjects' food behaviour in ways that we haven't understood. So there's lots to process in this assessment task, and I'm hoping that these tools and summary gives you better ideas on how to do it. Thank you very much for your attention.